There is an object in Oxford, England, that contains what may be the most consequential claim ever pressed into clay. It sits inside the Ashmolean Museum, a four-sided prism, roughly 20 centimetres tall and 9 centimetres wide, the colour of pale sand and river mud dried into permanence. It fits in two hands. You could carry it in a coat pocket. Its surface is dense, with the small wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform script, 2 columns of text, pressed into each of its 4 faces by a scribe who is otherwise unknown to history, working sometime around 1800 BC in the city of Larsa in what is now southern Iraq. The prism is hollow. It was originally threaded through a central wooden spindle so that it could rotate, so that whoever held it could turn it slowly and read all 4 sides, the way you might turn a slow-moving wheel. It is catalogue number AN 1923.444 in the Ashmoleans collections, though scholars refer to it more often as WB444, named for the British traveller Herbert Weld-Blundell, who brought it out of Larsa during a 1922 expedition and presented it to the museum the following year. He called it a prism. Modern scholarship calls it something more precise, the most complete surviving copy of the Sumerian King List. Wherever you are listening to this tonight, whatever room, whatever darkness, whatever quiet has gathered around you, take a moment to consider what you are about to hear. The Sumerian King List is a document that claims to record every king who ever ruled the ancient land of Mesopotamia. Not some of the kings, not a regional partial record. Every king, from the very first ruler of the very first city, onward through millennia of dynasty and conquest and flood and collapse, all the way to the Isin dynasty of the early 2nd millennium BCE, city after city, ruler after ruler, the same document, the same claim, maintained, copied and recopied across approximately 3,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization. The text opens with 8 words that have puzzled scholars for more than a century. In the original Sumerian, the phrase is Nam Lugalbanda, after the kingship descended from heaven, not arose, not was invented, not developed, descended from heaven. Whatever that phrase meant to the scribe who pressed it into the clay, whether it was theology, history, metaphor, or memory of something else entirely, those 8 words established the document's governing premise from its very first line. Kingship was not a human invention. It was a thing that came down, a thing that existed before the first city was built, a thing that was given, not created. And the document's central argument, repeated in identical formulaic language hundreds of times across its text, is that this thing, once given, was never truly lost. It was taken, transferred, moved from city to city, dynasty to dynasty, age to age, but it was never broken, never extinguished, never begun again from nothing. Then Eridu was defeated, and the kingship was taken to Bad-tibira. Then Bad-tibira was defeated, and the kingship was taken to Larag. Then Larag was defeated, and the kingship was taken to Zimbir. After the flood swept over, and the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish, the same language, the same verb, not given to a new city, not founded in a new city, taken as if it were a physical object, as if it was something that could be carried. This is the question that the clay has been holding for 4,000 years, and that no one has yet answered to everyone's satisfaction. Was there truly a single, unbroken thread of legitimate royal authority running through every major Sumerian city-state for 3,000 years? Not as conquest, not as coincidence, but as a continuous and deliberately preserved mandate. And if there was, what exactly was being preserved? A bloodline, a body of knowledge, a set of institutions, a memory so old it predated the flood? Or was it something the scribes constructed, a story told to make power seem inevitable, to make each new ruler seem like the natural and destined successor to the very first king who stepped out of the waters of Eridu? Both possibilities are extraordinary, and the records that survive, pressed into clay, buried under centuries of sand, excavated from the ruins of cities that have not been inhabited for 3 millennia, give us enough to investigate, if not enough to conclude. If you're just settling in tonight, take a breath, find your position. This investigation is going to move slowly, the way the records themselves move, carefully, without rushing past the details that matter most. Before we can understand what the King List claims, we have to understand the world it came from, because the land that produced this document was itself one of the most remarkable human achievements in recorded history, a civilization that appeared, according to our best evidence, with very little warning, in a flat and inhospitable plain between two rivers, and proceeded to invent, or perhaps, as some of the texts themselves suggest, to restore almost everything we still use today. That land was Sumer, and its story is where this investigation begins. The land between the rivers. Picture the landscape first, because it matters. Southern Mesopotamia, the region the ancient Greeks called the land between the rivers, from the Greek words for the Tigris and the Euphrates, is not, at first inspection, an obvious cradle for civilization. The terrain is almost entirely flat. There are no mountains to provide natural defence. There is very little stone for building. There is no native timber. The summers are ferociously hot, regularly reaching temperatures above 50 degrees Celsius in the interior plains. The soil, left to itself, tends towards salt. The rivers deposit mineral-rich silt, but without careful water management, the land salts over within a generation of cultivation and becomes barren. What the land does have is the rivers themselves, and the silt they carry, and the extraordinary fertility that silt creates when water is carefully managed. The Tigris and the Euphrates descend from the mountains of what is now eastern Turkey and northern Iraq, carrying with them the accumulated mineral wealth of entire mountain ranges. They flood annually, unpredictably, violently, in ways that could destroy as easily as nourish, and then recede, leaving behind thin films of fresh sediment that with irrigation can grow crops in quantities that still astonish agricultural historians. It was this equation, harsh environment, extraordinary fertility, the need for collective management of water, that scholars have long argued drove the Sumerian achievement. You cannot irrigate a flat plain alone. You need coordination, record-keeping, storage, distribution. You need, in short, the beginnings of administration. And administration, once it begins, tends to grow. The people who first settled this region in what archaeologists call the Ubaid period, beginning roughly around 5500 BC, overlapping with and eventually replaced by the Uruk period from around 4000 BC onward, are still partially mysterious to us. We do not know with certainty where the Sumerians came from, or whether the Ubaid period settlers were their ancestors. The Sumerian language itself, the language in which the King List and all its companion documents are written, is what linguists call a language isolate. It has no demonstrated relationship to any other known language, ancient or modern. It did not come from the Semitic languages of the surrounding regions. It did not come from the Indo-European family. It stands alone, grammatically and lexically, in a way that has resisted explanation for over a century of dedicated scholarship. What we can say with confidence is this: by approximately 3500 BC, in the city of Uruk, modern Waka, in what is now the Muthanna Governorate of Iraq, something was happening that had not happened anywhere else in the world. People were building monumental architecture. They were developing a system of pictographic notation that would, within a few centuries, evolve into the world's first known writing system. They were manufacturing standardized pottery on a scale that implies industrial organization. They were maintaining complex administrative systems, tracking goods and debts and labor across large populations. And they were doing all of this not gradually, not incrementally in the way that conventional models of cultural development might predict, but with a speed and sophistication that continues to surprise archaeologists who study the period. The Uruk phenomenon, as scholars call it, has been described by some researchers as the first true urban revolution, a transformation not just of settlement patterns, but of the entire framework of human social organisation, occurring over what, in archaeological terms, is an almost instantaneous window of time. Uruk at its height, around 3000 BC, may have held a population of 50,000 people, making it, at that moment, the largest city on earth. It had a monumental temple complex, the Iana, House of Heaven, dedicated to the goddess Inanna. It had organised craft production. It had what appears to be one of the world's first planned urban layouts, with streets, drainage, and distinct quarters for different functions. It had, embedded in its administrative records, the earliest evidence of writing, clay tablets recording the flow of grain and animals, the names of workers, the obligations of institutions. South of Uruk, at the edge of the marshlands where the rivers met the Persian Gulf, sat Eridu, a city so ancient that Sumerian tradition considered it the first city ever built. Archaeological excavations at the site, conducted between 1946 and 1949 under the direction of Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd on behalf of the Iraqi Department of Antiquities, revealed 17 successive building levels beneath the surface, the earliest dating to approximately 5400 BCE. At the very base of the sequence, they found the remains of a small mud brick platform that may be the earliest known temple in Mesopotamia. At Eridu's heart, beneath thousands of years of accumulated occupation, the investigators were looking at the physical remains of the moment when human beings first began to build permanent sacred spaces. The Sumerian King List says that after kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. The archaeological record confirms that Eridu was genuinely among the oldest continuously occupied sites in southern Mesopotamia. The convergence is not proof of anything, but it is the kind of convergence that makes careful scholars pause. By the early dynastic period, roughly 2900 to 2350 BC, the Sumerian landscape had filled with cities. Kish in the north, near the point where the Euphrates and Tigris ran closest together. Uruk and Ur in the south, near the Gulf. Nippur in the centre, the great religious city dedicated to Enlil, lord of wind and storm and the moving air. Lagash, east of the Euphrates, with its patron deity Ningisu. Umma, Adab, Shuruppak, Sippar, Larak, a constellation of city-states, each with its own temple complex, its own patron deity, its own administration, its own royal house. These cities were not, as far as we can determine, unified under a single political authority for most of this period. They competed with each other, formed alliances, fought wars, and periodically dominated their neighbours. The detailed records of one such competition, the long-running conflict between Lagash and Umma over agricultural land and water rights, survive in considerable detail in royal inscriptions from the period, making it one of the most thoroughly documented border disputes in ancient history. It lasted, by those records, for more than a century, with both sides invoking divine authority for their positions. Yet the King List, compiled during and after this same period, presents all of these cities not as rivals, but as sequential holders of a single mandate. One city holds kingship, it falls. Kingship passes, the next city holds it. And so the chain continues, unbroken, for page after page of closely written cuneiform. What was being described? And who decided how the description would read? Those questions lead us to the document itself and to the peculiar institution in the centre of the Sumerian world that seems to have been responsible for creating it. Kingship descended from heaven. The Sumerian word is Nam-Lugal. Nam is a nominalizing prefix, transforming a quality or condition into an abstract concept. Lugal means king, literally big man, from Lu and Gal, ig or rate. Together, Nam-Lugal means something like the state or condition of kingship, not a specific king, not a specific dynasty, but the abstract institution of royal authority itself. And the Sumerian King List's most radical claim, the one that makes it different from every other regnal list in the ancient world, is that this institution, Nam-Lugal, was not invented by human beings. It was not the product of necessity or social evolution or military conquest, though all of those things are present in the historical record. It descended from heaven as a complete and already formed institution with its own nature, its own obligations, and its own rules for where it could legitimately reside. This is not merely metaphor, or at least the Sumerians do not appear to have treated it as metaphor. The concept appears with the same matter-of-fact directness in which they recorded grain rations and cattle counts. The preamble of the King List reads, Nam Lugar ante dether bar, Nam Lugar Eridu Gaam 3. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. There is no elaboration, no mystical language, no ceremony of explanation. The descent of kingship from heaven is presented as a historical fact, stated once, as a premise from which everything else in the document follows. To understand what this claim meant, it helps to understand the parallel text known to modern scholars as the Eridu Genesis, named by the great Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobson, who published the primary English translation of the document in 1981 in the Journal of Biblical Literature. The Eridu Genesis survives on several fragments, the most important of which is a cuneiform tablet catalogued as CBS 1673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia, excavated at Nippur during the University of Pennsylvania expeditions conducted between 1889 and 1900. The tablet dates to approximately 1600 BC, though the composition it records is believed to be considerably older, possibly originating in the year 3 period or earlier. The Eridu Genesis deals with 3 connected events: the creation of human beings by the gods, the establishment of the first cities and the first kings, and the great flood that nearly destroyed everything. In the portion relevant to our investigation, the text describes the moment when the gods, acting together, convened as a divine assembly, decide to establish the institution of kingship in the world. The language is striking. The text speaks of the exalted crown and throne of kingship descending from heaven as physical objects. The crown, the throne, not the concept, but the physical regalia of royal authority conceived as having existed in the divine realm before any human king ever sat upon them. The institution precedes the kings who would hold it. The mandate precedes the man. This is the theological framework within which the entire Sumerian understanding of royal authority operates, and it is worth pausing to absorb its implications. If kingship descended from heaven as a divine institution, complete and prior to any human dynasty, then every king who ever legitimately ruled did so not because of his own power, not because of his family, not because of his armies, but because he had been entrusted with something that, originally, belonged elsewhere. And if that is true, then what transfers between cities when the King List says the kingship was taken to Kish or the kingship was taken to Uruk is not merely political dominance. It is the divine object itself, the mandate, the crown that descended from heaven, moving from one custodian to the next, according to some logic that the text implies, but never fully explains. The question of what that logic is, what determined which city received the mandate next, and why, is one the scholars have wrestled with for generations. But before we can properly investigate it, we need to understand a third text, one that runs alongside both the King List and the Eridu Genesis, and appears to shed light on the nature of kingship as a thing that can be transferred. In the Nippur Temple archives, excavated in those same University of Pennsylvania campaigns that yielded CBS 10673, there exists a composition known to modern scholars by its ETCSL designation as Text 1.3.1, the myth of Inanna and the Me. The Me, the word has no exact English equivalent, though divine laws or the powers of civilization come closest, are described in this text as a set of discrete transferable properties that together constitute everything civilization needs in order to function. They are held in the story by the god Enki in his temple at Eridu, and the goddess Inanna, patron of Uruk, travels to Eridu to obtain them from him. The text lists them in remarkable detail, among them kingship, the office of high priest, the scribal art, descent into the underworld and return, truth, falsehood, the destruction of cities, lamentation, music, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the builder, sexual intercourse, prostitution, the kiss, power, treachery, justice, the holy standard, the quiver, the sword, the shield, and more, over 100 discrete properties in some recensions, all conceived as transferable objects that Inunar carries away from Enki's house and into the boat of heaven, sailing them to Uruk. The me are not metaphors. Not in the way this text presents them, they are things. Physical, possessible things, at least in the cosmology of the text, that can be held in one place, stolen from one god, carried across water, and delivered to another city, including, explicitly and specifically, kingship itself. What this tells us about the King List's framework is significant. The idea that kingship was a transferable divine property, not created by human ambition, but descending from heaven, not destroyed by military defeat, but merely relocated, was not an isolated claim in the King List. It was the operating cosmological assumption of multiple major Sumerian texts, written across several centuries, found at multiple sites across the landscape of southern Mesopotamia. The concept was, in short, the consensus view of what kingship meant. And there is one more document from the Nippur archive that bears directly on this question, the Tumal Chronicle, a text that records the ritual care of the temple at Tumal near Nippur across successive dynasties. The Tumal Chronicle names specific kings and their cultic activities at this sacred site, and its list of dynasties overlaps substantially with the Sumerian King List. More than that, it presents the same governing logic, successive royal houses from different cities sharing custodianship of a single sacred institution. The kings change, the cities change, the institution continues. This, then, is the theological architecture within which the bloodline question must be examined. Before we ask whether a single lineage of rulers controlled Mesopotamian civilization for 3,000 years, we have to understand that the Sumerians themselves did not necessarily think of continuity in terms of blood. They may have thought of it in terms of mandate, in terms of the me, in terms of a crown that came down from heaven and could not be destroyed, only taken. Whether blood and mandate travelled together or separately, or in ways that the surviving tablets can illuminate but not confirm, that is the investigation this document invites. The list that should not exist. Let us be precise about what we are actually holding when we hold the Sumerian King List, because the document's existence is itself a puzzle before its content is even considered. The Weld-Blundell Prism, WB444, Ashmolean Museum accession number AN 1923 port 444, is the most complete surviving copy of the composition. It measures approximately 20 centimetres tall and 9 centimetres wide, with 4 equal rectangular sides, each face carrying 2 columns of cuneiform text. Its central bore is hollow, suggesting it was mounted on a spindle to rotate. It was found in Larsa, a city that was one of the major power centres of the Old Babylonian period, and it dates to approximately 1800 BC, which places it about 2 centuries after the last dynasty it records, the Isin dynasty, had received kingship. The prism was dated internally by scholars to year 11 of the reign of Sin-Magir of Isin, the last ruler mentioned in the composition. It is, in other words, a document written by people who were themselves still living inside the story it tells, looking backward across what they apparently believed to be an unbroken chain of royal succession stretching to before the flood. But WB444 is not alone. The Sumerian King List survives in various fragmentary forms across at least 16 known copies, tablets, prisms and fragments found at multiple sites across Mesopotamia. The first fragment ever published was identified by the German-American scholar Hermann Vollrath Hilprecht, who described a tablet from the Nippur excavations in 1906. That fragment is catalogued as CBS 13062 in the Penn Museum. The second major version was published in 1911 by the French Dominican priest and Assyriologist Jean-Vincent Scheel, who identified a fragment from Susa in what is now southwestern Iran, placing the King List circulation significantly beyond the boundaries of Sumer itself. A tablet catalogued as UCBC 91819 and held in the Museum of Anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley, represents another independent copy, this one inscribed during the reign of an early Old Babylonian king. And the III Sumerian King List, abbreviated by scholars as the Uskal, is an older version of the composition altogether, with a colophon indicating it was copied during the reign of Shulgi of Ur, who ruled from approximately 2084 to 2037 BCE. This is the oldest known version of the composition. It predates WB 444 by approximately 2 centuries, and crucially, its content differs from the later versions in ways that tell us something important about how the document was used. Thorkild Jacobson, in his landmark 1939 monograph on the Sumerian King List, published by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, argued that the document should be treated with cautious respect, that its underlying core likely rested on older administrative lists of genuine historical value, even where the lengths of individual reigns had been exaggerated or invented. His reconstruction involved replacing the impossibly long reigns of early kings with estimated average reigns of 20 to 30 years, creating a chronology he believed was broadly consistent with the archaeological record of the early dynastic period. More recent scholars have been less willing to grant the document even that degree of historical reliability. Pieter Steinkeller, one of the leading Assyriologists of the late 20th and early 21st century, has argued that the Sumerian King List was most likely first composed during the Akkadian period, during or shortly after the reign of Sargon of Akkad, as a piece of political literature, designed to position Sargon's dynasty as the natural heir to the hegemony of Kish. In this reading, the document is not a historical record with mythological embellishments, it is a political argument dressed in the language of historical record. Steinkeller suggests the composition was then repeatedly revised and updated by successive rulers, including the Isin dynasty, which appears to have commissioned Book 44, each time adjusting the text to validate the current holder of power as the rightful heir to the chain. This scholarly debate is worth holding in mind throughout this investigation, because it frames one of the document's most puzzling features, the fact that it exists in so many versions, each slightly different, each reflecting the political needs of the moment of its composition, yet all of them maintaining the same fundamental claim: the city's chain, the dynasty's chain. The specific kings included or excluded shift from version to version, but the premise that there is one kingship, that it descended from heaven, that it has always passed to one city at a time, remains constant across every copy, from the oldest Ur-3 fragment to the latest Old Babylonian Prism. This consistency is what requires explanation. If the King List was simply political propaganda, a tool used by each new dynasty to claim legitimacy, then we might expect each version to be radically different, tailored specifically to the needs of the dynasty commissioning it. And indeed, there are differences. But the underlying structure, the governing logic of a single transferable mandate, persists in every version we have found. That structure was old enough and authoritative enough that even rulers who added or subtracted dynasties did not question its premises. Here is the anomaly that the mainstream scholarly view handles somewhat incompletely. The document claims to record kingship not as a succession of separate political experiments, but as a single institution with a single continuous identity across 3,000 years and more than a dozen cities. For that claim to have been maintained across centuries, across political upheavals that destroyed the very institutions that had previously used the document for propaganda, across periods when no single power was even in a position to enforce a particular narrative, there must have been something beyond political convenience sustaining it. What was that thing, and where was it kept? The answers to those questions point north and inland to the centre of the Sumerian world, to a city that was never, for most of its history, a military power and never a seat of empire, but which produced more copies of the Sumerian King List than anywhere else. A city that was described, in the texts themselves, as the place where the gods had established their council, where Enlil, Lord of Wind and Fate, had his temple. The city was Nippur, and its role in this story is unlike any other. Before the flood, one line of kings. The antediluvian section of the Sumerian King List is the part that seems, at first reading, most obviously mythological, and it is therefore the part that most rewards careful attention. In the version recorded on WB444, the document opens with the line we have already encountered: after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. From that point it lists 8 kings who ruled over 5 cities before the flood swept over the land. These 8 kings are, in the order given by WB444, Alulim and Alaugar of Eridu, Ameluana, Enmegalana and Dumuzid of Bad-tibira, Ensipasiana of Larag, Medaranki of Zimbich, and Ubartutu of Shuruppak. Their reign lengths range from 18,600 years, the shortest, assigned to Ubartutu of Shuruppak in some versions, to 43,200 years to Emeluana of Bad-tibira in the WB 444 version. The combined total of all 8 reigns is, in the WB 444 version, 241,200 years. These numbers have generated a century of scholarly debate. The dominant view is that they are symbolic mathematical constructs derived from the sexagesimal number system used in ancient Mesopotamia, a base 60 system in which the numbers 3,660 squared, the Sar, 600, the Ner, and 60s formed the core units of calculation. Scholars including Roten have observed that many of the antediluvian reign lengths are clean multiples of these units. 43,200 is 12 times 3,600, 28,800 is 8 times 3,600, 36,000 is 10 times 3,600. This mathematical regularity suggests deliberate construction rather than historical recording. But there is a layer beneath the numerical question that is less often examined, and it concerns not the lengths of the reigns, but the nature of the genealogical claim being made. The 8 antediluvian kings are not presented as mythological beings or gods, despite the fact that their reigns span periods far exceeding any human lifetime. They are presented as kings, as holders of Namlugal, the same institution of kingship that the rest of the document tracks through historical rulers. The same formulaic language applies to them. One city holds kingship, that city falls or is defeated, the kingship is taken to the next city. The structure of the succession is identical to what follows after the flood. Among the 8 antediluvian kings, one is identifiable from other Sumerian literary sources. Dumuzid of Bad-tibira, listed in WB 444 as reigning for 28,800 years, appears in the wider Sumerian mythological corpus as the divine shepherd, the consort of Inanna, and the central figure in the annual cycle of the sacred marriage rite that was performed in Sumerian cities for centuries. His presence in a list of human kings is, on the surface, puzzling. He is, by every other Sumerian text's account, a god or a semi-divine figure. Yet there he is, in the king list, governing Bad-tibira for 28,800 years between Enmegalana and Ensipasiana of Larag. The other antediluvian king who connects to the broader literary tradition is Ubartutu of Shuruppak, whose son, in several versions of the flood narrative, is the great flood survivor himself. In the Eridu Genesis CBF 673, the survivor is named Yasudra. In later Akkadian tradition, he becomes Utnapishtim of the Epic of Gilgamesh. In still later versions, he is Atrahasis. But in the Sumerian tradition preserved at Nippur, Yasudra is described explicitly as the son of Ubartutu, the same Ubartutu who appears as the last antediluvian king in the king list, the final holder of kingship before the flood swept over. This is the connection the texts embed. The last king before the flood was the father of the man who survived the flood. In other words, The King List does not present the flood as an interruption of the royal line so much as a near interruption, a catastrophe that was survived, and after which the same bloodline, or at least the same mandate, resumed. The Eridu Genesis fragment CBS 1673 records that after the flood, the gods restored kingship and the cities. The specific language, after the flood swept over, and the kingship descended from heaven, mirrors the King List almost exactly. It descended again, a second descent, the same institution, re-established. And the first post-flood city to receive it, in the most widely attested versions, is Kish, specifically a Kish that the text presents as the legitimate continuation of the pre-flood authority. Now consider the Epic of Gilgamesh, specifically the opening passages of Tablet 1, preserved in the standard Babylonian version on the British Museum tablet BMK 3200, which scholars date to the second half of the first millennium BC, but which represents a compilation of Sumerian and Old Babylonian source material considerably older. The very first lines of the epic establish Gilgamesh's identity through his bloodline. He is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, the offspring of the goddess Ninsun and the king Lugalbanda. His divine fraction comes through a specific maternal line. His authority as king of Uruk is inseparable from that fraction. Gilgamesh appears in the Sumerian King List as the 5th king of the First Dynasty of Uruk, reigning 126 years. He is placed there historically in the post-flood section as a verifiable human king, and yet his character in the epic is shaped entirely by his divine ancestry. The two representations are not contradictory in the Sumerian framework. A king could be both historically real and divinely descended, both a political figure and a holder of a mandate that came from heaven. This suggests something important about what the antediluvian section of the King List may have been doing. It was not simply creating mythological precedent for the post-flood kings. It was establishing the genealogical and theological ground from which the post-flood kings drew their authority. The extraordinary reign lengths of the antediluvian rulers are not the point. The point is the chain, the unbroken sequence, from Alulim of Eridu to the flood survivor's father, to the first post-flood king of Kish, to Gilgamesh, to every subsequent ruler the document records. What if the numbers were not meant to be taken as calendar years? What if they were meant to signal something else? The antiquity of the line, its divine origin, its continuity across a period so vast it exceeded ordinary human reckoning. What if the scribes who pressed those numbers into clay were not recording history in the way we understand history, but were making a theological argument that the authority they served had roots older than the flood, older than any city currently standing, older perhaps than civilization is? They knew it. The clay does not answer directly. But the patterning of the text, the same language, the same structure, the same formulaic claim of transfer rather than origin, across both sides of the flood horizon, suggests that whoever composed the King List believed, or wanted their audience to believe, that there was no break, that something had survived. After the flood, the same bloodline. After the flood swept over, and the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. This sentence, among the most quoted in ancient Near Eastern scholarship, deserves slower attention than it usually receives. It appears in the Sumerian King List at the transition between the antediluvian and post-diluvian sections, after the formula then the flood swept over, and it accomplishes in a single line a theological manoeuvre of remarkable precision. Note what it does not say. It does not say kingship began again. It does not say kingship was newly created after the flood. It says kingship descended from heaven. The same verb, the same phrasing, the same construction used for the very first descent of kingship at the document's opening. The descent happens twice. Before the flood, kingship comes down. The flood intervenes. After the flood, kingship comes down again. The same thing, returning. The implicit argument is that during the flood itself, during the period when no human city was standing, when the land was underwater, Nam Lugal returned to heaven. It was held there in reserve, and when the waters receded and the cities were rebuilt, it descended once more, landing this time in Kish. This framing matters enormously because it means that, in the Sumerian theological understanding, the flood was not a break in the royal tradition. It was a pause, a held breath. The institution itself was indestructible. It could not be destroyed by water or catastrophe or the collapse of every city on earth. It could only be withheld temporarily by the gods who had originally given it. The post-flood First Dynasty of Kish is recorded in WB 444 as consisting of 23 kings with reign lengths between 300 and 1500 years, still extraordinary by human standards, but dramatically shorter than the pre-flood rulers. This contraction of reign lengths continues across the document's post-flood sections, with dynasties progressively displaying more historically plausible numbers as the list approaches the period for which we have contemporaneous archaeological evidence. The first king in the post-flood list, whose name is independently attested from inscriptions dating to his own period, is Enmerkar of Kish, described in WB 444 as ruling for 900 years, which is almost certainly symbolic, but whose name appears on actual clay fragments of vase inscriptions from the early dynastic I period, making him one of the earliest confirmed historical rulers anywhere in Mesopotamia. His successor, Aga of Kish, appears in the Sumerian literary composition known as Gilgamesh and Aga, a narrative text preserved on Nippur tablets that describes a military confrontation between the two rulers. The document places Gilgamesh in historical relationship with a real, verifiable king. This transition from the implausibly long-lived pre-flood kings through the still extraordinary but diminishing reign lengths of early post-flood dynasties into the archaeologically confirmable rulers of the mid-early dynastic period is one of the king list's most peculiar structural features. It behaves exactly as one might expect a record to behave if it were reaching backward from documented history into increasingly uncertain tradition, filling the earlier space with numbers whose symbolic function was more important than their literal accuracy. But here is where the bloodline question sharpens into something specific. Among the post-flood kings who can be placed in genuine historical context, a pattern of genealogical claim begins to emerge, one that is not simply a matter of the king list asserting continuity, but of individual kings explicitly and actively claiming descent from the chain. Shulgi of Ur, the king during whose reign the oldest known copy of the Sumerian King List was produced, claimed divine descent in terms that would have been extraordinary even by the standards of divine kingship. The Shulgi hymns, preserved on multiple Nippur tablets and catalogued in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature as texts 2.4.2.01 through 2.4.2. 04 are some of the most elaborate self-representations by any ancient ruler. In Shulgi-ar, a hymn composed for public performance, Shulgi describes himself as the son of Ninsun, the divine cow goddess of Uruk, and Lugalbanda, a semi-divine king of Uruk from several generations earlier. These are the same parents attributed to Gilgamesh in the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is not coincidence. Shulgi of Ur, ruling approximately 2084 to 2037 BC, was explicitly claiming kinship with the most famous semi-divine king of the entire Sumerian tradition, inserting himself into the genealogical line of Uruk's greatest ruler, thereby linking his Ur-3 dynasty not merely to the kings of Ur who preceded him, but to the entire antecedent tradition of heroic and divine kingship reaching back through the chain of the king list to the pre-flood world. Shulgi went further than any previous Mesopotamian ruler in this direction. He deified himself during his own lifetime, a practice almost entirely without precedent in Sumerian tradition before his reign. He established his own divine cult. He composed hymns in his own honour. He had temples built to himself. He rewrote, apparently, the very administrative and scribal curriculum of the Nippur schools to include his own compositions as standard educational texts, and it was during his reign that the Ur-3 Sumerian King List was copied. The relationship between Shulgi's self-deification and the production of the oldest surviving scale copy is not a matter of coincidence. Steinkeller and others have argued that Shulgi's dynasty had strong political reasons to commission a document presenting kingship as a single, continuous, divinely sanctioned institution, because the Ur-3 state was, in certain respects, a restoration rather than a continuation. The Akkadian Empire of Sargon and his successors had dominated Mesopotamia for roughly 2 centuries before Ur-3 emerged. For Shulgi to position himself as the legitimate heir to an unbroken chain stretching back to Eridu, while simultaneously claiming personal divine ancestry through Ninsun, was to make the most comprehensive claim to authority that the available tools of Sumerian ideology could support. The blood claim and the mandate claim were working together. The king's body carried divine ancestry. The institution he held carried divine origin. Together they made a case that was, in the Sumerian framework, nearly airtight, because it connected the current ruler not to a dynasty, not to a city, not to a military victory, but to the very descent of civilization itself from the realm of the gods. That claim would be repeated, adapted, and elaborated by every major Mesopotamian ruler who followed for the next 15 centuries. The specific bloodlines changed, the specific gods invoked varied, but the structure, the claim that this ruler was the legitimate heir to a mandate that had never truly been broken, remained the constant beneath every variation. The question that follows is whether that structure was invented wholesale by political propagandists, or whether it was reflecting something older, something preserved in the institutions and memories of a civilization that had been thinking about these questions for a very long time. The Royal Cemetery speaks. In 1922, the same year that Herbert Weld-Blundell brought WB 444 out of Lhasa and into the collections of the Ashmolean Museum, a British archaeologist named C. Leonard Woolley arrived at the ancient city of Ur with a joint expedition funded by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania. He would remain there, excavating, for 12 years. What he found, beginning in earnest with the 1926 and 1927 seasons, when his teams began to clear the cemetery area south of the great ziggurat of Ur, remains one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Beneath ordinary levels of burial, beneath hundreds of private graves dating to the early dynastic period, his excavators began to encounter something else. Tombs of an entirely different order of magnitude, sunk deep into the ground, lined with mud brick, filled with objects of gold, silver, lapis, lazuli and carnelian, and accompanied, in the most elaborate cases, by the carefully arranged bodies of dozens of attendants who appear to have died alongside their royal masters. Woolley called them the Royal Tombs of Ur. The designation has stuck. The most complete of these tombs is designated PG 800 in Woolley's excavation records, and it is attributed to a woman named Pwabi, whose identity is known from a small cylinder seal found with her body bearing her name and the Sumerian title Nin, Lady or Queen. Her tomb contained her own burial chamber and a death pit, a deep shaft in which, when Woolley's team cleared it, they found the remains of approximately 23 attendants, musicians, soldiers, servants, accompanied by instruments, weapons, and personal objects, all arranged with a precision that suggests not violent execution, but something closer to ritual. A lyre was found among the musicians' remains, its wooden frame long decayed, but its gold and lapis lazuli balls head decoration intact, one of the most recognisable objects now in the Penn Museum's collection. An adjacent tomb, PG 789, contained objects bearing inscriptions identifying the occupant as Meskalamdug, a name that also appears on a gold helmet found in the same area, bearing the inscription Meskalamdug, meaning hero of the good land, and which has been tentatively linked by some scholars to a king of the First Dynasty of Ur, though the identification is debated. The objects in Mescalamdug's burial include gold vessels, weapons, and personal ornaments of extraordinary craftsmanship. What the rule tombs demonstrate, at minimum, is that during the First Dynasty of Ur, a period corresponding to the post-flood section of the Sumerian King List, when Ur's rulers appear as historical figures in the document, royal identity was treated as something categorically different from ordinary human identity. The scale of the mortuary provision, the evident belief that the royal person required the continuation of their court in death, the extraordinary investment of material wealth, and apparently human life in the maintenance of royal status after death, all of this speaks to a conception of kingship as something more than political office. The Sumerian texts that survive from this period consistently support this material evidence. Kings in Sumerian literature and inscription are not merely administrators or military commanders. They are described as chosen by specific deities. Enlil chooses them, Inanna loves them, and elevates them. The divine selection of individual kings is described not as a permanent feature of a family, but as a specific personal act of divine favour that could be withdrawn as well as given. The key Sumerian term is Namen, the enship, the lordship, associated specifically with priestly royal authority of a kind distinct from the Lugal, the big man of military power. In the earliest Sumerian periods, these two forms of authority appear to have been held by different figures in different cities. Eridu, the oldest city in the King List, is associated with the onship, the priestly dimension of royal authority. Kish, the first post-flood city, is associated more strongly with the Lugal, the military king. The merger of these two roles, sacred authority and martial power in a single person, is one of the evolutionary developments the King List documents across its long span. But what the royal tombs add to this picture is a material confirmation of what the texts assert, that during the period when the King List was first being formulated and copied, Sumerian rulers were investing enormous resources in the physical expression of their royal identity in a way that treated that identity as something requiring maintenance, transmission, and extraordinary care across the boundary of death. Consider what that means for the bloodline question. If kingship was a divine mandate that descended from heaven and could only legitimately reside in one city at a time, and if that mandate was held by a specific royal person whose identity was so important that dozens of people followed them into death to maintain the court, then the transmission of that mandate to the next king was not a casual political act. It was a moment of extraordinary theological significance, requiring the right person, the right lineage, the right ritual context. The death pits of Ur suggest that the people of the First Dynasty understood this with a seriousness we can still feel, 4,000 years later, in the weight of the gold and the silence of the bones. The me, laws that could be carried. There is a word in Sumerian that has resisted translation for as long as scholars have been working with the language. The word is me, pronounced roughly as the English word may, and it appears in Sumerian texts across centuries in contexts that range from the mundane to the cosmological. It has been translated as divine laws, divine powers, civilizational attributes, sacred functions, and the essential properties of things. None of these captures it exactly. The closest approach may be to say that the me are the essential natures of the things that constitute civilization, not the things themselves, but the powers that make those things what they are and allow them to function. Kingship is a me. So is the priesthood. So is the descent into the underworld. So is scribal art. So is truth. So is the sword. So is music. So is the kiss. The myth of Inanna and the me, ETCSL text 1.3.1, preserved on multiple Nippur tablets in the collections of the British Museum and the Penn Museum, describes what happens when these me are moved from one place to another. In the story, Inanna, the goddess of Uruk, travels by boat to Eridu, the city of the god Enki. Enki entertains her lavishly with beer and feasting, and in the course of their meeting, whether through Enki's generosity or Inanna's cleverness, or, as the text implies, some combination of both, Inanna acquires the me from Enki and carries them away on her boat, back to Uruk. The text lists the me one by one as Enki gives them to Inanna. The list is extraordinary. Nam En, the high, Nam Lugal Kogul, the noble, enduring crown, the throne of kingship, the exalted sceptre and star, the holy standard, the robe of office, descent into the underworld and ascent from it, the scribal art, the craft of the smith, leather, working, building, the various forms of ritual music, wisdom, understanding, fear, terror, peace, weariness, victory, counsel, and many more. What this text demonstrates is that for the Sumerians, kingship was conceptually identical in structure to every other civilizational attribute. It was a transferable power, held initially at Eridu Enki's city, the oldest city, and capable of being carried to another city. The transfer of kingship from Eridu to subsequent cities, as described in the King List, follows exactly this structural logic. Kingship as a me, movable from one custodian to another. But the text implies something else as well, something more subtle. When the me travel, they do not simply change administrative address. They bring with them everything associated with them. When Inanna brings Namlugal to Uruk, she brings the crown, the throne, the sceptre, the standard, the robe, all the physical instantiations of royal authority. The me and its material expressions are inseparable. You cannot have legitimate kingship without the regalia. You cannot have the regalia without the mandate. This has direct implications for how we read the royal tombs of Ur. The extraordinary objects buried with Puabi and Meskelemdug, the gold, the lapis lazuli, the elaborate musical instruments, the weapons of office, were not simply luxury goods. They were, in the Sumerian conceptual framework, the material expressions of the me of kingship. The objects were part of the mandate, not merely its symbols. And this raises a question that the texts raise implicitly but never answer directly. When the King List says the kingship was taken to the next city, what was physically taken? Was it only an abstract authority? Or was there a set of objects, regalia, records, possibly physical tablets or tokens, that travelled with the mandate, carried from one city to the next as tangible proof of legitimate succession? We cannot confirm this from the surviving texts, but the logic of the me framework suggests it strongly. And there is one more layer to consider. The me of scribal art is in the list alongside the me of kingship. They travelled together in Inanna's boat from Eridu to Uruk. In the Sumerian understanding, writing and royal authority are not separate powers. They are both me. They are both parts of the same package of civilizational attributes that constitutes a functioning city-state. This suggests that the institution that kept the records of kingship, the scribal tradition, the temple archives, the trained writers who pressed cuneiform into clay, was not merely a service provider for political power. It was part of the same complex of divine powers that included kingship itself. The scribes who maintained the King List, who copied it generation after generation, who produced 16 surviving versions across 5 centuries of political upheaval, they were not clerks. They were custodians of a me. That custodianship was concentrated more than anywhere else in Mesopotamia in the city of Nippur. The scribes who wrote the line. Nippur should not have been a great city. By the standards of ancient Mesopotamia, where power flowed from military strength, agricultural wealth, and control of trade routes, Nippur was poorly positioned. It sat in the centre of the Mesopotamian plain, far enough from the major rivers to be disadvantaged for irrigation, without the defensive geography of Kish or the maritime access of Ur. It was conquered repeatedly by every major power in the region across 3 millennia, and it never formed the core of a lasting empire of its own. Yet Nippur was, by the testimony of the cuneiform record, the most sacred city in Sumer, not because of its wealth or its walls, but because of its temple. The temple was called the Kur, House of the Mountain, and it was dedicated to Enlil, the god of wind and storm and the breath that animates the world, who was, in the Sumerian pantheon, second only to heaven itself in cosmic authority. Enlil's temple at Nippur was the place where, according to Sumerian theology, the divine council met, and where the destinies of gods and men were decided. It was where Enlil held the tablets of destiny, the Dup-Shemati, the records on which the fates of everything in the cosmos were written. And it was, according to Sumerian political tradition, the place whose endorsement was required for any claim to legitimate kingship to be considered valid. No king, however militarily powerful, was considered the rightful holder of Namlugal unless Enlil had granted him kingship from Nippur. This tradition is attested across a remarkable range of sources. Royal inscriptions from multiple dynasties describe the king's relationship to Enlil's temple. Hymns to various rulers emphasize that Enlil has chosen them, elevated them, given them the scepter. The Tamil Chronicle records specific acts of royal patronage at Nippur across successive dynasties, and the physical record of the Nippur excavations, the University of Pennsylvania campaigns from 1889 to 1900, directed in the field largely by John Henry Haynes, with Hilprecht serving as epigrapher and interpreter, revealed the material reality behind this textual picture. Those excavations uncovered the remains of what appears to have been a significant scribal school and temple archive, from which approximately 23,000 cuneiform tablets were eventually recovered. Among these tablets were more copies of the Sumerian King List than from any other site, confirming that Nippur was the primary centre for the composition's preservation and transmission. But the tablets found at Nippur included much more than the King List: hymns to kings, mathematical texts, lexical lists, literary compositions, astronomical records, and administrative documents spanning the full range of Sumerian intellectual production. What was being maintained at Nippur was not simply a royal archive. It was something closer to a complete repository of Sumerian knowledge, a curated collection of everything the civilization considered worth preserving, organised, copied, and taught in the scribal schools attached to Enlil's temple. The scribal curriculum at Nippur has been partially reconstructed by modern scholars, including the pioneering work of Samuel Noah Kramer and Keschberg, from the practice tablets and educational texts found in the excavations. The curriculum was highly standardized. Students learned to write by copying established texts in a fixed sequence. They progressed from simple signs to complex literary compositions, moving through a canon of texts that included administrative formulas, mathematical tables, grammatical paradigms, and, at the higher levels of training, the great literary works of Sumerian civilization: the hymns, the myths, the royal praise poetry, and the King List. What this means is that every trained scribe who passed through the Nippur system, and trained scribes, were the administrative backbone of every major Mesopotamian institution, from temple estates to royal courts, carried with them, in memory and in hand, the specific formulations of the king. List's claims: they knew the opening phrase. They knew the formula for transfer between cities. They had copied it, probably multiple times, as part of their education. The King List was not a document that required physical access to a single clay tablet to exert its influence. It was a text that lived in the trained memory of every literate person in Mesopotamian administration. It was, in the most literal sense, part of the institutional software of the civilization. This gives us a different way of understanding how the bloodline, or the mandate, was maintained across 3,000 years. It was not maintained primarily by a ruling family. It was maintained by a scribal tradition, by a training system that reproduced in each generation of administrators the same understanding of what kingship was, where it came from, and how it legitimately passed. The scribe who copied the Sumerian King List during the reign of Shulgi was doing the same thing as the scribe who copied it 2 centuries later at Larsa, and the scribe who worked from that copy to produce the version that would become WB 444. They were all maintaining the same text, with its same governing logic, its same formulas, its same claim about the nature of royal authority. The scribes were the bloodline, Sargon, and the problem of usurpation. There is a figure in the Sumerian King List who does not fit cleanly into the framework of inherited divine mandate, and examining him honestly is essential to the integrity of this investigation. His name was Sargon of Akkad. He ruled from approximately 2334 to 2279 BCE, and by most assessments he was the most consequential ruler in the ancient Near East before the reign of Hammurabi of Babylon. He created the first territorial empire in recorded history, uniting the city-states of Sumer under a single administration and extending his control north into what is now Syria and northwest Iran. He built a new capital city called Akkad, whose exact location has never been confirmed archaeologically, and established a dynasty that would persist under his successors for approximately 2 centuries. He appears in the Sumerian King List in a specific and revealing way. WB 444 describes him as the cupbearer to Ur-Zababa, king of the 4th dynasty of Kish, a servant, in other words, in the court of a legitimate king. He then defeats Lugalbanda of Uruk, the last king of the 3rd dynasty of Uruk, who had himself briefly unified much of Sumer, and establishes his own dynasty at Akkad. In the language of the King List, the kingship thus moves from Kish to Uruk, and then from Uruk to Akkad. The same formula applies. But there is something different here. Sargon is not presented as the son of a king. He is not presented as the heir of the line he is usurping. He is a cupbearer, a servant who takes power. The legend of Sargon, a later text preserved in multiple copies from Assyrian and Babylonian libraries, though originally composed considerably earlier, addresses this apparent problem with the birth narrative. In the legend, Sargon describes himself as the son of a humble mother, Arbitiates, who could not acknowledge him, and a father he did not know. He was placed in a basket and set on the river as an infant, a story with obvious parallels to other foundling narratives of the ancient world. He was found by Aki, a gardener, who raised him. He became a gardener and then a cupbearer, rising through service to the court. The structure of this narrative is not accidental. By describing Sargon's origins as humble and mysterious, his father unknown, his lineage obscured, the legend simultaneously admits the problem of his irregular ascent and addresses it through divine selection. Sargon was not elevated by blood. He was elevated by the specific choice of Inanna, who loved him and gave him her favour. The goddess selected him. The mandate came to him not through inheritance, but through divine appointment. In the Sumerian theological framework, this is not a contradiction of the bloodline principle, it is its ultimate expression. If kingship is a divine institution that descends from heaven at the gods' pleasure, then the gods can give it to whomever they choose. They can interrupt a genealogical line and begin a new one. What makes the new line legitimate is not its connection to the old one, it is the divine selection that elevated it. And the proof of divine selection, in Sumerian understanding, is success, the military victories, the administrative achievements, the longevity of the dynasty. Sargon's Akkadian dynasty lasted approximately 150 years under his successors, with his grandson Naram-Sin extending it to perhaps its greatest geographical extent. This durability was, in the Sumerian understanding, its own proof of divine sanction. The gods would not have permitted it to endure so long had they not willed it. Yet the problem does not entirely dissolve. What Sargon's presence in the narrative does is expose a structural tension that the King List framework contains but never fully resolves. The tension between legitimacy by bloodline and legitimacy by divine appointment. These two principles do not always converge on the same person. The way the King List handles this tension is instructive. It does not exclude Sargon. It includes him as cupbearer, as the transitional figure between one legitimate dynasty and his own. But it absorbs him into the same structure, applying the same formula, kingship was taken to Akkad, that it uses for every other transfer. In the language of the document, Sargon's usurpation is not a usurpation at all. It is the natural and inevitable movement of the divine mandate from one city to the next. This absorptive quality is one of the most powerful features of the King List framework. It is capable of incorporating almost any transition, inheritance, conquest, usurpation, even periods of chaos. The document says of one turbulent period, then who was king, who was not king, before continuing as if the chaos was simply another entry, and reframing it as the legitimate flow of a single mandate. The mandate, in this framework, cannot be broken, it can only move. Shulgi and the art of claiming the line. Of all the rulers who held Nam-Lugal across the 3,000 years documented in the Sumerian King List, none invested more explicitly or more elaborately in the project of placing himself within the unbroken chain than Shulgi, the second king of the Third Dynasty of Uruk. Shulgi ruled from approximately 2084 to 2037, a reign of 47 years that by the standards of Mesopotamian history was both long and extraordinarily well documented. He was the son of Ur-Nammu, the founder of the Ur-3 dynasty, who had risen to power after the collapse of the Gutian interregnum, a period during which outsiders from the Zagros Mountains had dominated much of Sumer, a period that the King List records in deliberately uncertain terms before. Restoring the chain with the dynasty of Utu-Hengel of Uruk, and then the Third Dynasty of Ur. Shulgi inherited a dynasty with a problem. The Ur-3 state was, in historical terms, a restoration, a reassertion of Sumerian political culture after a period of disruption. It's claimed to be the legitimate continuation of the single mandate documented in the King List required active maintenance, and Shulgi maintained it with a thoroughness that no predecessor could match. The Shulgi hymns, preserved on Nippur tablets in the Penn Museum and catalogued in the ETCSL as texts 2.4.2.001 through 2.4.2.04, constitute the most elaborate program of royal self-fashioning in the ancient Sumerian record. In Shulgi A, the hymn that appears to have been most widely distributed, Shulgi describes his education. He claims to have mastered the scribal arts himself, to have studied in the Aduba, the scribal school, and emerged from it as a fully trained scribe king. He can read and write, he can calculate, he can compose hymns. He is not merely the patron of learning, he is its practitioner. This claim, whether literally true or not, performs a specific function in the context of the King List tradition. The scribal art is a me. It is one of the divine powers that Inunar carried from Enki's house. A king who mastered the scribal art was not just educated, he was personally embodying one of the divine properties of civilization. He was not dependent on scribes to maintain his records, he was himself a guardian of the me. In Shulgi B, the hymn describes his physical accomplishments with similar extravagance, his athletic prowess, his skill as a runner. He claims to have run from Nippur to Ur in a single day, a distance of roughly 160 kilometres, his courage in battle, his wisdom in judgment. These claims are not simply boastful. They are claiming, point by point, that this king embodies the complete range of royal attributes, that nothing essential to kingship is absent in his person. But the most significant genealogical claim appears in the invocations of his divine parentage. Shulgi consistently describes himself in the hymns as the son of Ninsun, the divine cow goddess, the same goddess who was Gilgamesh's mother. He describes Lugalbanda, the heroic semi-divine king of Uruk, as his father or his guiding deity. Some hymns use language suggesting a sacred marriage, that Shulgi's conception was itself a divine act, making him not merely the son of human parents, but the child of a union between mortality and divinity. The specific lineage being claimed here Ninsun and Lugalbanda as parents is the lineage of Gilgamesh. Shulgi, in other words, was inserting himself into the bloodline of the most famous king in Sumerian literary tradition, claiming descent from or connection to a figure who was described in the very tablets being studied by Shulgi's own scribes as 2/3 divine. Whether this claim had any biological basis is impossible to determine, and was almost certainly unprovable even at the time. What matters is the function it performed. It connected the current king through an explicit genealogical assertion to the post-flood chain of heroic kingship documented in the King List, and through that chain to the antediluvian kings, and through them to the original descent of kingship from heaven. The claim was total. The blood, the mandate, the scribal tradition, and the divine election all pointed to the same person, sitting on the same throne at ordering the same scribes who had already been trained to reproduce the King List, to reproduce it once more, this time with his dynasty as its culminating entry. Shulgi did something else that is often overlooked in discussions of the King List. He deified himself. In approximately the 18th year of his reign, he began to use the divine determinative before his name, the small wedge-shaped prefix that in cuneiform distinguishes divine beings from human ones. He became, in the written record, a god, not posthumously, as some earlier rulers had been honoured with quasi-divine status after death. During his own lifetime. The implications of this for the bloodline question are significant. If the king is divine, then the bloodline that produces kings is a divine lineage. The 2/3 divine formula applied to Gilgamesh is, in Shulgi's self-presentation, applicable to him as well. The chain from Eridu to III is not merely a political succession, it is a genealogy of the divine in the world. The cities that fell and rose again. The most repeated phrase in the Sumerian King List is also its most philosophically loaded. Then was defeated, and the kingship was taken to... Scholars have counted the variations on this formula dozens of times across the document's surviving versions. It applies to the antediluvian cities. Eridu falls, Bad-tibira receives the mandate, Bad-tibira falls, Larag receives it. It applies to the post-flood cities. Kish falls in various ways and various times. Uruk receives it. Receives it. Arwan receives it. The list continues for the full extent of the document. The word translated as defeated or overthrown in English is, in the Sumerian, connected to the same root used for the way a city might fall in battle. But the verb used for the transfer of kingship, the moment when the mandate moves, is not the same as the verb for conquest. The formula distinguishes between the city being defeated and the kingship being taken. One is a military event, the other is something different, an act of taking, a transfer, as if someone carried something out of the fallen city and brought it to the next. This distinction between the fall of a city and the movement of the mandate is central to understanding what the document is claiming. It is not claiming that the next city conquered the previous one and thereby obtained authority. It is claiming that the mandate itself, independent of military outcome, moved. The defeated city lost its political power, but the mandate had already moved, or was moving concurrently, to its next proper residence. The Gudea cylinders, held in the Louvre as items AO3293 and AO4153, offer a case study in how a ruler navigated exactly this kind of transition. Gudea ruled Lagos as its Ensi, its city governor, from approximately 2144 to 2124 BC during the Gutian interregnum, a period when the Sumerian King List records the mandate as residing in the land of Gutium rather than in any Sumerian city. Gudea did not claim the title Lugal, the full king. He did not claim to hold Namlugal. What he claimed was the specific authority of the Ensi, a priestly administrative role with its own legitimacy, distinct from the kingship tracked by the King List. The Gudea cylinders describe in the most elaborate literary form of any Sumerian royal inscription, how Gudea received a divine dream commanding him to build the great temple of Ningirsu at Girsu, the sacred quarter of Lagash. The dream came to him in elaborate symbolic form: a giant figure who gave him the plan of the temple, a woman who set up a stylus, a man with a tablet of lapis lazuli, and Gudea travelled to Nippur to consult the priests of Enlil about its meaning. Only after receiving divine confirmation did he proceed with the building. What the Gudea cylinders demonstrate, in the context of the bloodline and mandate question, is the way in which a ruler without a claim to the King List tradition could nevertheless participate in its underlying logic. By building temples, by maintaining the divine cult, by demonstrating personal piety and divine election, a ruler who could not claim Namlugal could still claim a form of divine mandate, a relationship to the same powers that governed the larger tradition. Gudea's Lagash had been excluded from the King List tradition almost entirely. Lagash does not appear in WB 444 at all, a fact that puzzled early scholars and led to significant debate about the document's comprehensiveness. But Lagash's exclusion from the King List did not mean that Lagash was outside the broader tradition of divinely sanctioned authority. It meant rather that Lagash held a different kind of mandate, the authority of the Ensi, derived from the local patron deity, rather than the authority of the Lugal, derived from Enlil's universal endorsement. This distinction suggests that what the King List was tracking was not the full range of legitimate authority in Mesopotamia, but specifically the lineage of Namlugal, the particular form of kingship that had descended from heaven at the beginning of the document. Other forms of authority existed alongside it, running in parallel, sometimes intersecting and sometimes not. Lagash's powerful dynasty of Urnanche, Eonatum and Entemena, rulers who fought the famous wars with Umma and left some of the most detailed administrative records of the early dynastic period, were real and powerful rulers. They simply were not, in the specific framework of the King List, holders of the transferred mandate. The document's silence about Lagash is paradoxically one of the strongest pieces of evidence that it was not simply a political document created to flatter the powerful. If the King List were pure propaganda, the patron city of any scribe who composed a version would likely have been included. Lagash's consistent absence, even from versions composed in periods when Lagash was arguably the most sophisticated state in Sumer, suggests that the document was following a specific principle, tracking a specific thing, rather than simply cataloguing whoever happened to be powerful at the time. That specific thing was the chain, the single line of Namlugal that, in the document's own logic, could only reside in one city at a time and could not be invented, doubled, or created afresh, only transferred from its current holder to the next. The cities fell, the mandate moved. Eridu, Bad-tibira, Kish, Uruk, Ur-Awan, Adab, Mari Kish again, Akshak Kish a third time, Uruk a second time, Ur a second time, Adab again, Mari again, and on, each city receiving the same thing, losing the same thing, passing it forward. The specific faces and names and military achievements of individual kings are almost incidental to the structure. They are vessels. The document is about what they carried. 3 ways to read the record. We have now moved through the primary evidence, the prism in the glass case, the cities, the theological framework, the physical record of the tombs, the concept of the me, the scribal tradition, the cases of Sargon and Shulgi, the formula of transfer across the full length of the King List. It is time, as careful investigators, to step back and consider what 3 very different interpretive frameworks make of all of this. The first framework is the one that modern mainstream scholarship, in its most cautious form, tends to favour: the Sumerian King List as deliberate political literature, a sophisticated piece of ideological construction designed to serve the legitimating needs of successive ruling dynasties. In this reading, there is no actual continuous bloodline, no genuine unbroken mandate. There is instead a series of independent political entities, separate dynasties, separate cities, separate royal families that shared a common cultural idiom about the nature of kingship. When each new dynasty came to power, it reached into this shared idiom and used it to construct a claim: we are not new. We are the next link in a chain that began with the gods themselves. The scribes of Nippur maintained the document because Nippur's own position as the sacred centre of endorsement required a document whose existence validated the endorsement they provided. If kingship always required Nippur's blessing, then Nippur always had something to offer, and the King List was the institutional record of that offering. This reading explains a great deal. It explains the variations between versions of the King List, each adjusted to serve the narrative needs of a different dynasty. It explains Lagash's absence. Lagash never tried to position itself within the single mandate framework. It explains the extraordinary reign lengths. They are symbolic rather than historical, creating a mythological depth of time that makes the tradition seem ancient enough to be credible. What it does not fully explain is the persistence of the framework itself across periods when no single dynasty was in a position to enforce it. After the collapse of the Ur III state around 2004 BC, the period the King List itself describes, with the haunting phrase "the very foundation of Sumer was torn out," the document continued to be copied in multiple independent centres, maintaining its structure during the political fragmentation of the Isin Lhasa period. The propaganda explanation requires a sponsor. The document seems to survive without one. The second framework treats the King List and its companion texts as encoded cosmological teaching, a form of theological education that uses the structure of historical narrative to transmit a specific understanding of the relationship between divine order and human society. In this reading, the extraordinary reign lengths are not errors or exaggerations, but deliberate markers that signal a different register of meaning. We are now in the domain of primordial time, of the great cycles, not ordinary human history. The Me framework, the divine selection of kings, the descent from heaven, these are not claims about historical events, but about the eternal structure of legitimate authority. Kingship is always and everywhere the same thing, the divine mandate, carried by whoever the gods have chosen, answerable to the Council of Nippur, transferable but not destroyable. This reading is sophisticated and accounts for much of the internal consistency of the documents. It treats the Sumerians as philosophical theologians rather than propagandists, giving their texts the same serious attention one might give to a religious or philosophical tradition. Its weakness is that it tends to bracket the question of whether any of it was also meant historically, and the presence of verifiable figures like Enmerkar, Gilgamesh, whose historicity is at minimum plausible given independent corroboration, and every ruler from the Akkadian period onward, suggests that the document was not purely symbolic. The third framework, the most speculative, and the one that requires the most careful handling, takes seriously the possibility that the King List preserves the memory of an actual institutional continuity, not necessarily a biological bloodline in the modern genetic sense, but a genuine, continuous political religious tradition that transmitted the symbols, the records, and the institutional knowledge of legitimate kingship across the changes of dynasty and city. In this reading, what persisted across 3,000 years was not a family tree, but an institution. The scribal tradition of Nippur, the theological framework of Nam-Lugal, the physical regalia of kingship, and the training system that reproduced, generation after generation, the administrators, who knew how to perpetuate it. The Me framework actually supports this third reading more than the first two. If the Me of kingship is a transferable property, real, possessible, physical in some sense, and if it travels with its associated objects and institutional knowledge, then what the King List is describing as the movement of kingship from city to city might be the movement of exactly this. Package, the records, the trained scribes, the regalia, the theological framework, landing in the new city and enabling its rulers to hold the mandate not by birth alone, but by taking possession of everything that kingship, as a me, entailed. The Assyriologist Jacobson believed the underlying administrative lists that fed the King List were genuinely historical. Steinkeller believes the document was created as Akkadian political literature. More recent scholars, like Mark van der Meerroep, have argued it should be used very cautiously, if at all, as historical evidence. None of them has argued that the tradition it encodes was invented without any historical foundation. Even the most sceptical assessments acknowledge that the document reflects real political culture, real theological belief, and real institutional history, even if the specific kings and reign lengths are not reliably historical. What they have not fully addressed is the question the document itself most insistently raises: if the framework was purely constructed, why does it behave as if it were describing a single thing? Why does the verb stay the same, taken, not founded, not conquered, not begun, across every transfer, in every version, across 5 centuries of copying? Why does a document used by multiple competing dynasties, each with different political interests, maintain a structure that places no single dynasty above any other, but insists on the continuity of an institution none of them could control? That question remains genuinely open, and its openness is perhaps the most honest thing the clay has to offer. What the clay remembers. It is late wherever you are. The room is quiet. The particular darkness of your night has settled around you, and the space between waking and sleep is close now. That threshold where the mind loosens its grip on certainty and allows things to simply be what they are, without requiring resolution. So let the question rest here, without forcing it into a shape it will not hold. There is an object in Oxford, England. It is made of clay from the floodplain of southern Mesopotamia, pressed and dried and fired into permanence sometime around 1800 BC by a scribe whose name we do not know. It is 20 centimetres tall. It fits in 2 hands. Its 8 columns of closely pressed cuneiform text describe, in the same repeated formula, the movement of a single thing across the full span of a civilization. That thing, whatever it was, whatever name is most accurate for it, was considered important enough to record. Not once, but at least 16 times, in copies that have survived partial destruction, burial, excavation, and the passage of 4,000 years, not in one place, but in multiple cities across the Mesopotamian landscape, not for one dynasty's purposes, but for the purposes of many dynasties, each of whom found in the same framework the vocabulary they needed to describe their own authority. Something was being preserved. The clay was the vessel for it. The scribes who copied it were the custodians. The cities that received the mandate were the addresses to which it was delivered. Whether that something was a biological lineage, a thread of blood reaching from Alulim of Eridu to the last kings of Essene, is a question the tablets cannot answer with certainty. Biology does not survive in clay. Genealogies can be constructed. Divine descent can be claimed by anyone with a scribe willing to write it. But here is what can be said, and said carefully, on the basis of what the evidence actually shows. For approximately 3,000 years, in the land between the rivers, there existed a continuous institutional tradition maintained by scribes, endorsed by the priests of Nippur, expressed in the theology of the me, enforced in the rituals of the royal cemetery, claimed in the hymns of Shulgi and the silence around Lagash, which held that there was one kingship, that it had come from somewhere beyond the human world, and that its legitimacy could not be manufactured, it could only be received. Every ruler who held that tradition, from Kish to Akkad to Ur to Isin, was participating in something larger than their own dynasty. They were claiming to be the current address of an institution that predated them, that would outlast them, and that was not, in the final analysis, theirs. The Sumerians themselves seem to have understood this. The King List does not celebrate dynasties, it marks their passage. One by one, the cities receive the mandate, hold it for their span, and then yield it, defeated, overthrown, their foundation torn out, while the mandate moves on. There is something almost peaceful in that pattern, once you allow yourself to sit with it. The cities are transient. The mandate is not. The kings die. Kingship descends again. The flood sweeps over. The crown comes back down from heaven. What the clay remembers, across its 4,000 years of silence and 45 centuries of being lost and found, is not the greatness of any particular king. It is the persistence of the thing they held, the unnamed, unprovable, untranslatable continuity of a civilization that kept insisting, in tablet after tablet, in formula after formula, pressed into clay with the careful hands of people who knew they were writing something that mattered, that something real had come down from somewhere, been carried forward through the flood, and was not finished yet. You have heard the evidence tonight. The prism in the glass case holds its 8 columns of text. The dead of the royal cemetery hold their lapis lazuli and their gold. The Gudea cylinders hold their dream. The Shulgi hymns hold their extraordinary claims. And the question holds its shape, the same shape it has held since the first scribe pressed the first wedge into wet clay and wrote the words that all of this began with, after the kingship descended from heaven. Whatever that meant, whatever it means still, the question is yours to carry now, as gently as the clay has carried it. Wherever you are tonight, let that be enough. Let the rivers run. Let the cities rise and fall and rise again in your imagination, each holding for its moment what it was given to hold, each passing it forward in the dark. The lament and the line. There is a category of Sumerian literature that scholars call the city laments. Long, elaborately structured poems composed in the aftermath of catastrophic political and military collapse, mourning the destruction of sacred cities and the departure of their protecting gods. Several survive. The lament for Ur, the lament for Sumer and Urim, the lament for Nippur, the lament for Eridu, each composed in the decades and centuries following the great collapse of the Ur III dynasty around 2004 BC, when Elamite forces from what is now southwestern Iran sacked the city of Ur, carried its last king Ibisin away in chains, and brought to an end the most administratively sophisticated state Mesopotamia had yet produced. These laments are not simple expressions of grief. They are, in their formal structure, theological arguments, and the argument they make is one that speaks directly to the question this investigation has been pursuing. The lament for Ur, preserved on Nippur tablets and catalogued in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature as text 2.2.2, opens with the goddess Ningal, the moon god Nanna's consort and the divine patroness of Ur, pleading before the assembly of the gods. She begs Anu and Enlil not to destroy her city. Her plea is rejected. The text records Enlil's decision in language that should by now feel familiar. The god withdraws his protection from the city. He removes his favour. He allows the storm to come. What is being described in theological terms is the same act that the King List describes in political terms when it says a city was defeated and the kingship was taken. The city does not fall because its enemies are stronger. The city falls because the god has withdrawn. The mandate has been retracted. The me of kingship has been recalled. The lament for Ur frames this with devastating clarity. It does not blame the Elamites. The Elamites are, in the poem's logic, almost incidental, instruments of a divine decision, not its authors. The decision belonged to Enlil, and once Enlil decided that Ur's time as the seat of Namlugal had ended, no wall, no army, no human effort could alter the outcome. This framing, which appears across all the surviving city laments with remarkable consistency, reveals something important about how the Sumerian scribal tradition understood the relationship between divine mandate and historical outcome. Military defeat was not evidence that a dynasty had been wrong. It was evidence that its appointed time had ended. The mandate had moved on. The city was mourned, not condemned. And here is the implication that the laments carry, even in their grief. If the mandate had moved on, it had moved somewhere. The lament for one city's loss was implicitly also the announcement of another city's gain. The transfer formula of the king list, then the kingship was taken to the next city, is the administrative counterpart to the theological event that the laments describe. The city weeps. The scribe records the transfer. The chain continues. This parallel between the lament literature and the king list framework has not always received the attention it deserves, partly because the laments are emotionally affecting texts that resist the kind of dry structural analysis that king list scholarship tends to employ. But the convergence is precise. Both genres, composed by the same scribal tradition at Nippur, operating within the same theological framework, treating the same sequence of events, describe the movement of divine authority from one custodian to the next, not as chaotic or arbitrary, but as governed, painful, lamented, but governed. The mandate had rules. It moved according to a logic that the Sumerians believed they could observe, even if they could not control it. And one of those rules, embedded in both the laments and the king list, was this: the departure of the mandate from one city did not destroy the mandate. It relocated it, the law that travelled with the crown. There is one more dimension of the bloodline question that has not yet been examined, one that operates not in theology or genealogy, but in the domain of law. Among the most significant achievements attributed to the Ur-3 dynasty is the Code of Ur-Nammu, the oldest surviving law code in human history. Ur-Nammu, the founder of the Ur-3 dynasty and Shulgi's father, composed this code sometime between approximately 2100 and 2050 BC. It survives on several cuneiform tablets, the primary copies found at Nippur and Ur, with the Istanbul tablet representing one of the most complete versions. The code's prologue establishes its theological grounding with the same directness we have seen throughout this investigation. Ur-Nammu claims to have been chosen by the moon god Nana and by Enlil to establish justice in the land. His authority to legislate derives from divine selection. The law is an expression of the mandate. What the Code of Ur-Nammu represents in the context of the broader bloodline question is the institutional expression of what the Me of Kingship actually contained. The Me of Kingship was not merely the right to sit on a throne. It carried with it specific responsibilities and specific powers, including the power to establish and enforce law. A legitimate king was not only a military commander and a divine representative, he was a lawgiver, a maintainer of justice, Sisatu in Sumerian, the making straight of what is right, whose authority to define and adjudicate human conduct derived directly from the divine mandate he held. This means that when the king list records the movement of Namlugal from city to city, it is also implicitly describing the movement of the entire institutional package of legitimate governance, including the legal tradition. Ur-Nammu's law code was copied. Shulgi refined and expanded it. Later rulers referenced and built upon it. The same legal principles, graduated penalties, protection of the widow and orphan, the weighing of evidence, reappear in the laws of Lipit-Ishtar of Asin, the next major lawgiver after the Ur-3 period, whose code was composed in Sumerian around 1934 BCE and also survives on Nippur tablets. Here the transfer of legal tradition becomes visible as a material process. Lipit-Ishtar, the fifth king of the Isin dynasty, the dynasty that ends the king list on WB 444, composed his law code in the same formal structure as Ur-Nammu's, with the same divine authorization prologue, the same claims of Enlil's selection, the same language of justice establishment. He was not inventing a legal system. He was inheriting one with all its theological underpinnings intact, and presenting himself as its current custodian. The Isin dynasty as a whole is worth pausing on, because its relationship to the Ur-3 state it succeeded illuminates the continuity question with particular sharpness. Ishbi-Erra, the founder of the Isin dynasty, was himself an official in the Ur-3 administration, a high-ranking servant of the last Ur-3 king, Ibbi-Sin. When the Ur-3 state began to collapse under pressure from Elamite incursions and Amorite migrations in the early 2nd millennium, Ishbi-Erra positioned himself at Isin, a city in central Babylonia, and gradually extended his control over the territories the Ur-3 state had formerly administered. He did not destroy the Ur-3 system, he stepped into it. He maintained the Sumerian scribal tradition, continued Ur-3 administrative practices, and claimed through his dynasty's commissioning of WB 444 the legitimate inheritance of the entire chain documented in the King List. It was almost certainly the Isin dynasty that was responsible for the version of the King List we know best. The prism in the Ashmolean Museum ends with the Isin kings. It was dated internally to year 11 of Sin-Magir, the last Isin king mentioned, a ruler who died before the dynasty itself ended, which means the prism was current when inscribed, not retrospective. The dynasty was, in effect, writing itself into the culminating position of the 3,000-year chain it claimed to inherit. Whether that claim was legitimate by genealogical standards, whether any Isin king could actually trace biological descent through the Ur-3, Akkadian, Uruk, Kish, or antediluvian lines, is a question the record cannot confirm. But in the Sumerian framework, as we have seen, biological descent was only one of several ways a legitimate transfer could occur. Divine selection, institutional succession, the maintenance of the scribal tradition, the performance of the proper royal rituals, the endorsement of Nippur, all of these constituted forms of legitimate inheritance that could operate independently of blood. The Isin dynasty appears to have held all of them. That, in the language of the King List, was sufficient. The sacred marriage and the body of the king. There is one institutional mechanism through which the divine mandate was transmitted, and through which something closer to a genuine bloodline might have been maintained, that has not yet entered this investigation, because it operates in a domain that academic scholarship has treated with particular caution. The practice is known in modern scholarship by its Greek name, hierosgamos, the sacred marriage. In the Sumerian tradition, it refers to a ritual in which the king, acting as the human embodiment of the divine shepherd Dumuzid, was united in some form, whether literally or ceremonially, with the high priestess of Inanna, who acted as the goddess herself. Through this union, the king received Inanna's divine love, her protection, her fertility blessings, and, critically, her endorsement of his reign. Evidence for the sacred marriage ritual dates to at least the late 3rd millennium BC in Sumerian cities, with hymns describing the ritual preserved among the Nippur tablets. The famous sacred marriage hymns, love songs of exceptional literary quality, describing the preparations for and aftermath of the divine union, were composed and performed as part of the royal cult, most probably during major festivals connected to the agricultural calendar. The Ur-3 kings in particular left extensive evidence of participating in this ritual. Multiple hymns connect Shulgi, Shusin, and other Ur-3 rulers to Inanna's favour through the sacred marriage framework. What this ritual meant for the question of royal bloodlines is genuinely complex. If the king who participated in the sacred marriage was understood to be, even temporarily or symbolically, the divine husband of Inanna, and if children born in the context of that ritual or that dynastic tradition were understood to carry a specific form of divine descent, then the sacred. Marriage was a mechanism for producing, generation after generation, rulers who could claim divine parentage not merely by assertion, but by institutional participation in a defined and repeatable rite. The Sumerian texts do not make this argument explicitly. They do not say the son born of the sacred marriage inherits the mandate, but the logic implicit in the me framework that kingship as a divine property travelled with its associated institutions and rituals suggests that the sacred marriage was part of the package. A city that held Nam-Lugal also held the right to perform the sacred marriage. A king who held the mandate also held the right to be Inanna's consort. The ritual was not separate from the mandate, it was one of its expressions. This is where the bloodline question becomes most genuinely ambiguous and most genuinely interesting. If the sacred marriage was not merely symbolic, but involved actual human participants, and if the children of those participants were positioned within royal succession, then there may have been a biological thread running through the Sumerian royal tradition that was understood and maintained not in the modern sense of genetic descent, but in the ritual sense of divine parentage, renewed in each generation through the performance of the same rite in the same institution. We cannot confirm this from what survives. The sacred marriage texts describe the ritual's spiritual and agricultural dimensions. They do not provide administrative records of its biological consequences. But the consistency with which Ur-3 kings invoke Ninsun and Lugalbanda as their divine parents, the same parents attributed to Gilgamesh, the same lineage that the King List connects to Uruk's post-flood dynasty, suggests that what was being maintained, consciously and deliberately, was a specific genealogical claim. And that claim required at minimum a tradition of consistent invocation that treated these particular divine ancestors as the relevant ones. Something was being passed down, whether it moved through biology or institution or both. The people who maintained the King List and performed the sacred marriage and copied the hymns of Shulki treated it as real, as specific, and as something that mattered enough to defend with everything they had. Their architecture, their rituals, their law codes, their literary traditions, and the patient, repeated labour of pressing the same words into fresh clay, generation after generation, long after the cities they described had fallen to silence. What was never broken? Step back now from the individual pieces, the prism, the tombs, the hymns, the laments, the law codes, the sacred marriage, and allow the pattern to come into focus as a whole. What the 3,000 years of Sumerian and early Babylonian civilization preserved across every political disruption and military catastrophe and dynastic change was not a name, not a face, not even, in any simple sense, a family. What was preserved was a framework, a set of ideas about the nature of legitimate authority so deeply embedded in the institutions of the civilization that it could not be dislodged even when every physical structure that housed it was destroyed. The framework had a theology, kingship descended from heaven. The framework had a cosmology, the me of kingship were divine properties, transferable but indestructible. The framework had an institution, Nippur, with its Temple of Enlil and its scribal school, endorsing and recording each new holder of the mandate. The framework had a ritual, the sacred marriage, renewing the divine connection in each generation. The framework had a legal tradition, the law codes, each one presenting its king as the current agent of divine justice, each one structurally identical to the last. And the framework had a document, the King List, maintained in multiple copies across multiple centuries, insisting with its identical formulas that the thing being tracked had never truly been interrupted. This is not the bloodline in the sense that modern readers might instinctively imagine, a single unbroken genetic line traceable from a founding ancestor to every subsequent heir. The evidence does not support that reading, and the surviving scholarship gives us good reasons to be cautious about it. Dynasties changed. Outsiders were absorbed. The specific biological connections between one ruling house and the next are, in most cases, either unverifiable or demonstrably absent. But there is another kind of bloodline, one that the Sumerians themselves appear to have considered more important than biological descent. and that is the bloodline of institutional continuity, the transmission from generation to generation and city to city of the same understanding of what kingship was, where it came from, what it required, and how it was legitimately held. The people who maintained this transmission were not a family, they were a civilization, and the record they left behind, pressed into clay, buried under the ruins of cities, excavated by archaeologists working a century ago with brushes and measuring tapes in the heat of the Iraqi plain, is one of the most sustained arguments for institutional continuity ever made by any human society. The Sumerians did not merely claim that their civilization was ancient. They claimed that it was connected, that the king sitting on the throne in Ur in 2050 BC was holding, through a specific and traceable series of transfers, the same mandate that had descended from heaven and landed in Eridu before the flood. Whether or not that claim was biologically accurate, it was institutionally real. The mandate was maintained because people believed in it, taught it, copied it, performed its rituals, enforced its laws, and mourned its temporary departures with poems of devastating beauty. And when the last king of Assene received the mandate, and when the scribe who made WB 444 pressed the final lines of its record into clay, and when that prism was sealed and stored, and eventually buried under the accumulated debris of Lhasa, the chain did not end. It simply paused, waiting, as it had waited before, through floods and invasions and the silencing of every city it had ever called home. Until the moment, 4,000 years later, when an archaeologist lifted it from the earth in 1922 and carried it to Oxford and placed it in a glass case where it sits today, still rotating, if only in the imagination, its 8 columns of cuneiform, still saying what they have always said. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, the same thing, waiting to be read again. Sleep well.